The news arrived without a sound. It started not with an explosion, but with a series of silent, blinking dots on a radar screen. On the morning of October 19, 2025, deep within the North American Aerospace Defense Command facility at CFB North Bay, analysts watched a ghost appear. It was a fast-moving contact, an unidentified aircraft slicing through the frigid air of the high Arctic. It moved with a purpose that felt unsettling. The initial quiet in the command center quickly gave way to a low, urgent hum of activity. Voices became clipped. Procedures were enacted with practiced speed. The calm of a routine Sunday was shattered in an instant. Canada reacted with a swiftness born of instinct and protocol. 2 CF-18 Hornet fighter jets were scrambled from CFB Cold Lake, their engines roaring to life, breaking the prairie stillness. Their mission was clear: intercept, identify, challenge. But even as the Hornets climbed towards the stratosphere, the initial reports were already spreading like wildfire through secure channels to Ottawa. The Prime Minister was briefed. The Minister of National Defence was pulled from a weekend engagement. The mood in the capital shifted from weekend calm to high alert. This was not a drill. This was not a lost civilian plane. This felt different, more deliberate, far more concerning. The initial shock was palpable, because the intruder was not from a rival nation. It was not a Russian bear bomber probing the edges of sovereign airspace. A familiar dance of deterrence. The identification, when it finally came, was more confusing and, in some ways, more infuriating. The aircraft was a Saab Gripen E, a fighter jet belonging to Sweden, a nation Canada considered a close partner and a friend. The incident unfolded over the Beaufort Sea, a desolate and strategically vital stretch of the Arctic Ocean. At precisely 08:43 Mountain Time, the Gripen E departed from a temporary forward operating base in Greenland, a detail that would only surface hours later in intelligence reports. The jet was known for its advanced electronic warfare suite, low radar cross-section. It flew a carefully planned low-altitude route. It hugged the contours of the sea ice, using a technique designed to minimize detection by long-range radar systems. This was not a simple flyby. It was a demonstration of stealthy insertion, a tactic honed for penetrating contested airspace without warning. The flight was a masterclass in calculated audacity. The Gripen's path was what triggered the alarm. It flew directly through the Canadian Air Defence Identification Zone, a buffer of international airspace that Canada monitors to give itself reaction time against potential threats. While entering the ADZs is not strictly illegal, international protocol dictates that all aircraft identify themselves and file their flight plans. The Swedish jet did neither. It remained electronically silent, refusing to respond to hails. It then veered perilously close to a known Canadian submarine patrol route, a highly sensitive area. The move was too precise to be a navigational error. It was a deliberate, pointed gesture. Canadian forces learned of the intrusion through their network of Northern Warning System radars, a chain of sensors stretching across the Arctic. The system flagged the fast-moving, low-flying target, but its signature was faint, a whisper on the screen. It took precious minutes for analysts to confirm it was a high-performance military aircraft, and not a sensor ghost or atmospheric anomaly. By the time the CF-18s were airborne and racing north, the Gripen had already completed its run. It lingered just long enough to be visually identified by the Canadian pilots before turning back towards Greenland, its mission apparently complete. The entire event lasted less than an hour, but its impact would resonate for much longer. The Gripen itself is a key part of this story. It is a lightweight, single-engine, multi-role fighter, lauded for its agility and cost-effectiveness. Sweden markets it aggressively as a smart fighter, an alternative to the larger, more expensive jets built by American firms. The Gripen E model features a sophisticated sensor suite and data link capability, allowing it to see and communicate without giving away its own position. The pilot did not rely on brute speed, but on cunning and technology. The flight was a real-world advertisement for the jet's capabilities, demonstrating it could operate undetected in the backyard of a major NATO power. The official confirmation from the Department of National Defense landed like a thunderclap. The statement was brief, cold, and packed with fury. It called the Gripen's flight an irresponsible and provocative maneuver and a breach of established international aviation protocols. The language was unusually blunt for diplomatic communications, signaling a deep sense of outrage within Canada's military and political leadership. Fighter jets were placed on a higher state of readiness across the country. Naval assets in the north were ordered to increase their surveillance patrols. The message was unmistakable. Canada's guard was up. Public reaction was a torrent of disbelief and anger. News channels ran the story on a continuous loop, pundits, retired generals offering their analyses. Headline, Swedish betrayal in the Arctic. Headline, Canada on high alert after Gripen intrusion. Headline, fury in Ottawa over shock flight. On social media, the leaked images of the lone Gripen became a symbol of the perceived affront. Canadians felt a collective sting of indignation. The political reaction was swift and fierce. Opposition demanded an emergency debate in the House of Commons. They accused the government of being caught flat-footed and asked how a foreign military jet could fly so close to sensitive areas without interception. The Minister of National Defense faced a barrage of questions. Critics framed it as a failure of northern surveillance capabilities. The Prime Minister spoke directly with the Swedish Prime Minister, expressing profound disappointment and demanding a full explanation. Diplomatic niceties were stripped away. Raw political anger. The anger in Canada was amplified by a deep sense of betrayal. Sweden and Canada have long been partners in the sky. Both members of the Arctic Council participated in joint exercises, cold response drills in Norway. Canadian pilots trained alongside Swedish pilots, sharing knowledge, building a rapport, mutual respect, shared democratic values, not rivals. Like-minded countries navigating a complex geopolitical landscape. History of cooperation made the Gripen's unannounced covert flight feel less like a probe and more like a stab in the back. Betrayal permeated discussions at every level. Diplomats who had spent years building bridges felt personally let down. They had operated on the assumption of transparency and good faith. The Gripen's silent run through the Abyss shattered that assumption. It suggested Sweden would put its own interest, commercial, strategic, ahead of its relationship with Canada. For Canada, proud of alliance building and multilateralism, such a unilateral act was hard to comprehend and even harder to forgive. Military-to-military ties, often insulated from politics, suffered a significant blow. Trust between Air Force commanders is built on predictable behavior, clear communication. When Allied aircraft operate in the same region, they talk to each other. They share flight plans. They deconflict their movements to avoid accidents. The Swedish pilot's deliberate radio silence was a direct violation of this unwritten code. It introduced a dangerous element of unpredictability into an already high-stakes environment. Canadian military planners were left wondering if they could ever fully trust Swedish operational plans again. Why would Sweden authorize such a risky and provocative move? As the initial shock subsided, analysts floated several theories. The most prominent theory centered on commerce. Canada is finalizing a new fighter jet selection to replace its aging CF-18s, a multi-billion-dollar contract. The Saab Gripen E is a main contender. Some experts called the flight a brazen marketing stunt. It was Sweden demonstrating the Gripen in a real-world scenario, showing off its stealth capabilities, showing off its electronic warfare capabilities, essentially telling the Canadian government, this is what our jet can do. It can even slip past your defenses. Another theory, a strategic warning. The Arctic is becoming more militarized and contested. Ice is melting, new shipping routes are opening, nations are jockeying for influence. Sweden, not an Arctic coastal state, still has heavy interests in high north stability. Analysts said the flight signaled to Canada and other NATO members. It said Sweden can project power into the region independently. It reminded allies Sweden is a serious military player and expects consultation on European and Arctic security. A third possibility, a test of Canada's defences, not solely for Sweden's benefit. In intelligence sharing, friendly nations sometimes probe defences to identify weaknesses a common adversary might exploit. The theory: Sweden tried to expose gaps in NORAD's northern sensor coverage, hoping to force Canada, the United States, to upgrade systems. It was a harsh, unsolicited favour, pointing out shared vulnerability before an enemy could. Defence expert Dr. Elina Velk was quoted, "You must not view this as a purely hostile act. It is an act of strategic communication. Sweden is communicating its capabilities, frustrations, relevance. It knows the Gripen is an underdog in the Canadian competition. This was a way to change the narrative. It was a calculated risk expected to make Ottawa furious. They asked whether demonstrating capability is worth the diplomatic fallout. This adds complexity, born of cold, rational risk-reward calculation." Section 6. The official response and the unspoken threat. Sweden's initial response did little to quell the anger in Canada. The Swedish Armed Forces issued a terse two-sentence statement. It confirmed that a Gripen E had been conducting a long-range training flight in the high north. All international laws and norms were respected. No airspace was violated. This carefully worded denial was seen in Ottawa as a masterpiece of evasion. While technically true, the jet never crossed into sovereign Canadian airspace. It ignored the provocative flight path and the deliberate breach of ADIS protocols. The lack of an apology or a detailed explanation was taken as an insult. Canada's diplomatic counter-move was firm and direct. The Canadian ambassador in Stockholm was instructed to lodge a formal diplomatic protest, a serious step between friendly nations. Ottawa demanded the Gripen's flight data recorder, the black box, and its communication logs. That request meant sharing sensitive operational information. Canada signaled it would not be satisfied with vague assurances. It wanted hard evidence to understand the pilot's intentions and the orders they followed. The unspoken threat: failure to cooperate would have serious bilateral consequences. The incident cast a long, dark shadow over the fighter jet competition. Gripen advocates in Ottawa went suddenly silent. The optics of buying from a country that embarrassed Canada's defences turned toxic. Competitors like F-35 makers quietly capitalized, emphasizing interoperability and trust within NATO. Canada began leveraging its position within key alliances. Officials raised the issue at a closed-door NATO meeting in Brussels, framing it as alliance cohesion and Arctic security. Sweden is not a NATO member, but a close partner. Being called out there is heavy pressure. Canada made clear this wasn't just a bilateral squabble, it was a test of Western security rules, and Canada expected allies to demand accountability and transparency from Stockholm. Section 7. Cracks in the shield. A technological reckoning. The Gripen's ghost-like flight through the Northern Watch Zone forced an uncomfortable and urgent reckoning within Canada's defence establishment. The primary question was no longer just why the Swedes did it, but how they did it so effectively. How did a single, relatively small fighter jet manage to penetrate so deep into a monitored zone before a robust track could be established? This question exposed potential cracks in Canada's multi-layered northern shield. It suggested that the aging northern warning system, a product of the Cold War, might be ill-equipped to detect modern, stealthier threats that fly low and fast. Military engineers and technicians immediately began a forensic audit of the sensor data from the incident. They reviewed the raw returns from every radar station that should have seen the Gripen. They were looking for blind spots, gaps in coverage between different radar sites, or potential vulnerabilities to the Gripen's advanced electronic jamming and deception technologies. The flight path was analyzed meter by meter to see if the pilot had exploited specific geographic features like canyons or coastal inlets. The incident was no longer just a diplomatic crisis. It had become a live fire test of a multi-billion-dollar defense network, and the initial results were unsettling. The event sparked an immediate and intense debate about the pace of modernizing NORAD. They had argued for new over-the-horizon radars, space-based sensors, and artificial intelligence systems to sift through data more quickly. The Gripen incident provided a powerful real-world argument for accelerating these investments. Section 8. Allies in the balance. The shockwaves from the Gripen incident rippled outwards, placing other nations in an awkward position. Canada's closest allies, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, watched the unfolding dispute with concern. On one hand, they had a treaty obligation, NATO, the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. They could not be seen to tolerate a deliberate provocation against a key member. On the other hand, Sweden was a crucial partner in Northern Europe, a bulwark against Russian ambitions in the Baltic Sea region. No one wanted to see a permanent rift between two important Western democracies. The United States, as the co-manager of NORAD, was particularly invested in the outcome. The Gripen had not only embarrassed Canada, it had exposed a vulnerability in the shared defense of the North American continent. The Pentagon issued a quiet but firm statement of support for Canada, emphasizing the importance of transparency and predictability in all military operations in the Arctic. Behind the scenes, American diplomats began working as intermediaries, urging restraint in both Ottawa and Stockholm. They pushed for a de-escalation of the public rhetoric and a move towards a private, technical dialogue. Other European nations walked a fine line. Countries that operate the Gripen, countries considering buying it, were in a particularly delicate position. They were reluctant to condemn Sweden, their defense supplier, but they also could not condone an act that undermined the established rules of the road for military aviation. Most governments opted for silence, hoping the dispute would be resolved quickly and quietly. The incident served as a cautionary tale for them, a reminder that even among friends, military power can be used to send sharp and unwelcome messages. The tension put a spotlight on the evolving security architecture of the Arctic. Section 9. The cold question remaining. Today, on October 19, 2025, the immediate crisis has passed, but the air remains thick with tension. The scrambled jets are back at their bases, the radar screens are clear, and the initial fury has cooled into a hard, cold resolve. The Gripen that sliced through the Arctic silence is now a symbol, a catalyst for a deep and uncomfortable reassessment of trust, technology, territory. The incident, for all its brevity, has left a permanent mark on Canada's perception of its security and its place in the world. It was a wake-up call, delivered in the most jarring way possible, a lesson written in jet fuel across the northern sky. In the aftermath, Canada's leaders are weighing their options. The path of pure diplomacy calls for patience, back-channel talks, a gradual rebuilding of trust with Sweden. The path of strength calls for a more forceful response, excluding the Gripen from the fighter competition, launching new and more aggressive sovereignty patrols, and pushing for formal censures in international forums. The government in Ottawa is caught between the desire to show resolve and the need to preserve a crucial European partnership. Every potential move is fraught with risk, a delicate calculation of national pride against strategic interest. Sweden, too, faces a critical choice. It can continue to hide behind legalistic denials, hoping the storm will pass, or it can make a gesture of reconciliation, share the flight data, issue a meaningful explanation, and work with Canada to establish clearer protocols for the future. The first choice might preserve the mystique of its fighter jet, but it would permanently damage its reputation as a reliable partner. The second choice would require humility and Maginot, but it holds the only real promise of repairing the breach and restoring the trust that was lost. The images from that clear, cold morning will linger in the collective memory. The ghost on the radar, the sleek fighter jet against the endless white, the silent challenge that echoed from the Arctic to the heart of government. This story is a stark illustration of 21st century power dynamics. The skies may be quiet now, but the questions raised by the Gripen's flight remain loud and clear. What will Canada do next?